I'm Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing my newest fancy Booktube hat. If you missed my new hat reveal, I will link it for you down below. But today I'm doing another Booktube SFF Babbles video. If you're unaware, Booktube SFF Babbles are video prompts in association with the Booktube SFF Awards. I'll link the Goodreads group and all other information down below. Basically, anyone can jump in and do a video or other social media recommendation post for science fiction and fantasy books for the given topic. I'm actually doing this one late. The time window for doing this video has already closed, but it's important enough, this one, that I feel like I need to do it anyways, and that is Own Voices, Science Fiction and Fantasy. Now, this is not the first time I've done a video like this on my channel. I like to try to do as many of the Booktube SFF Award Babbles as I can every year. And this is my third year doing the Booktube SFF Babbles, and it's the third year that there have been prompt topics to do with diversity. Now, the last 2 years, they've actually been split into two separate topics. Last year there was an LGBTQ plus characters and themes topic and an SFF featuring people of color topic, neither of which was explicitly Own Voices. In case you're unaware, Own Voices fiction basically just means that it's a book featuring characters who share the author's marginalization. So the implication is that the author is, to some extent, writing these people and that representation from experience. I will link my previous videos down below. For last year's SFF featuring people of color video, I specifically chose to talk about books by POC authors, and I even included a couple of recommendations for books I had read by POC authors that weren't about POC characters. So I basically changed that topic to be Own Voices plus other things written by POC SFF authors. But for LGBTQ plus characters and themes last year, I did not do that. I kept it as characters and themes. And the reason for that is that I find it a lot harder to find that information about queer authors unless they explicitly talk about how the queer rep in their books is Own Voices. Whether or not an author is a person of color is far more often public information than their sexual orientation or gender identity. And so I think that's a caveat I have to give for this video, because this video being Own Voices exclusively, I have found that I have many more things on my shelves where I can confirm that the POC rep is Own Voices. And a lot of the things that I've read with queer representation, you know, I may suspect that this is Own Voices, but I cannot confirm, and if I cannot confirm, it cannot be in this video. Anyways, I said I had 2 years worth of backlist of these diversity babbles topics. My videos from 2 years ago, I don't remember. I think it was just like POC SFF and LGBTQ plus SFF, and I don't remember exactly how I took those topics. But I will link them all below because I will not be repeating books that I've recommended in these Babbles topics previous years. And because I'm not repeating recommendations from those previous videos, this is pretty much going to be exclusively books I read in the last year since the last round of Booktube SFF Awards. It was the same for me last year. Those videos were a year's worth of reading recs. I think this is really helpful as an annual sort of check-in to sort of make sure that I am actually reading as diversely as I think I am, because I think I read very diversely. And then when I have to put together these lists after a year away, I am sometimes confronted with some of my own deficiencies in the diversity of my reading. So that was a long introduction, but I feel like these topics sometimes need them, especially when they're very sensitive topics, and I do have a long-running history of making these videos year after year. So the first books I do want to talk about are going to be those where I've previously recommended earlier books in the series, but at the time that I made those videos, I had not yet read these books. So I have 2 different books by Nnedi Okorafor, Akata Warrior, the sequel to Akata Witch, and Binti the Night Masquerade, the 3rd book in the Binti trilogy. Nnedi Okorafor is a Nigerian-American author. Both of these series feature themes of African identity and are about African protagonists. Akata Witch and Akata Warrior are YA. The Binti series is an adult novella trilogy, even though they have a younger protagonist who goes away to school. I think it deals with these themes in a more mature, adult-oriented way. The author refers to the Binti books as African futurist. They are about a Himba girl who is the first of her people to go to a prestigious space university, and she becomes embroiled in an alien conflict that follows her home when she returns. And the author refers to the Akata Witch books as African jujuist. They are YA fantasy that reads sort of on the younger side of YA. They are about an albino girl named Sunny who's from a Nigerian family. She was born in the States, but her family is back in Nigeria where she's growing up, and she is inducted into a sort of secret magical society of leopard people because it turns out she has magical potential, and she has to learn the ways of leopard society, manage her new double life, and face down some perilous magical threats. Binti the Night Masquerade is one of the Booktube SFF Award finalists in the short fiction or novella category this year. It is also on the Hugo shortlist this year. And Akata Warrior won the new YA award at the Hugos last year that is going to henceforth be called the Lodestar. Another book where I've recommended a previous book in this series in the past a couple years ago, and another one that's both Hugo and Booktube SFF Award nominated this year, is Record of a Spaceborn Few by Becky Chambers. The Wayfarers series is a series of companion novels as opposed to direct sequels. Both the first book, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, and this book, Record of a Spaceborn Few, feature female-female relationships, and that is own voices representation. The relationship in the first book was more of a romance that developed over the course of the story. In this, there's a major point of view character who is an older woman who's just in a long-term established marriage with another woman, and that's presented as a normal, healthy, complicated relationship that is nothing unusual in this society. Another series that I want to recommend books 2 and 3 of that I read this year is one where the first book never made it onto one of these recommendation lists for me, but those are going to be Raven's Stratagem and Revenant Gun, books 2 and 3 of the Machineries of Empire series by Yoon Lee. I think part of the reason that 9 Fox Gambit didn't make it onto one of these recommendation lists the year that I read it was because I didn't like it enough. I gave that one a 3-star rating, and both of these were 4 stars for me. But also, I think when 9 Fox Gambit released, a lot of attention was drawn to the idea that some of the things that were going on in this story that were not explicitly trans rep were sort of a metaphor for trans rep. Yoon Lee is a trans author. And that wasn't quite good enough for me as a cis person to want to hold it up and say, here is trans rep that you should read. In books 2 and 3, however, we do get a new major point of view character who's very present in both books, who is actually a trans man. So there is for real own voices trans rep in books 2 and 3 of this series. And then the other thing that I think went kind of right over my head when I was reading the first book, because this is such a sort of dive into the deep end, try to get your bearings world, that these books are set in, is that I just wasn't paying attention to the fact that this is a very Asian space empire. And that became more and more of like an oh duh, obviously thing for me as I kept reading in this series. So this series as a whole does have, in fact, both own voices, POC, and LGBTQ+ representation. Both of the first 2 books in this series were Booktube SFF Award nominees in the years that they were published. Revenant Gun is not. It is, however, on the Hugo ballot. Moving on, another Booktube SFF Award nominee in the debut novel category is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, who is also up for the Campbell Award this year. This is the first in an epic fantasy series inspired by the Sino-Japanese Wars, set in a fantasy nation that is sort of a stand-in for China. As you might expect, it is incredibly brutal when it comes to the atrocities of war. But given the historical inspiration for this series, I am really curious to see where she's going to take it in future books. A much, much lighter, fluffier read that I finally got to last year after a whole lot of people on Booktube had already read it and talked it to death, was Sorcerer to the Crown by Zen Cho. This is a historical fantasy set in an alternate Regency England with magic. Zen Cho is a Malaysian author who lives in the UK, and this book does center around characters who are people of color, some of whom are in fact Malaysian. This is a book that I haven't talked about or recommended much since reading it. I think it was because it was one of those things where I really enjoyed it while I was reading it, but it didn't really stick with me. I know that there's a sequel that came out just last month, and I do want to read it, but I'm worried that I won't remember the things that I need to remember. I think it's more of a companion sequel, so I think I'll be fine. But putting together a list for this video was a good reminder that, hey, this was a book I liked, I should probably read the next one. Next, I've got the first book in another series that I am not at all caught up on reading. Ooh boy, reminders for me to start reading all the things. But I have The Black Tides of Heaven by J.Y. Yang. This is sort of the first book in the Tensoret novella series. The first two were released at the same time, and you could ostensibly read them in either order, but this one I think chronologically takes place first, and it's the only one I've read. This is another one with both own voices, queer, and POC representation. J.Y. Yang is a non-binary Singaporean author, and this takes place in an Asian-inspired fantasy setting in a world where people are born without gender, and they choose their gender identity when they get older. So in this book, we're following two children who are twins growing up, and so throughout their childhood, they're both non-binary characters, and then they each have their own journey towards discovering their own gender identity. So that's very interesting. It's something that makes me want to read more of this series. I want to get more of this world building. Next, I'm going to mention the first of two books that I have claimed that I still owe you reviews for. I intend to do full written separate reviews for this book and the next one. They would make a good double review if it ended up working out that way. I'm crossing my fingers. I am having a hard time getting back into doing like actual book reviews, and the longer it goes since I've read these, the harder and harder it's going to be. Wish me luck. But the first of these that I want to talk about is Mirage by Somaiya Daud, which is the first book in a YA science fantasy series that is deeply and heavily inspired by the author's Moroccan heritage. I will tell you that my review will reveal some mixed feelings about the storytelling in this book and some of the more sci-fi fantasy aspects of the world building. But for me, the highlight of this book and the thing that makes this series one that I am watching and a book that I am excited to recommend, especially for own voices fiction, is that the cultural side of the world building and the way it plays into the story I felt was really incredibly well done. I felt like there was a complexity in the way this book deals with imperialism and cultural erasure and faith and identity that you don't always see in YA sci-fi and fantasy series that purport to explore those themes, even if some of the other aspects of this story were more middle-of-the-road YA for me. And then the second book that I still owe you a review of is In the Vanishers' Palace by Aliette de Bodard. This is essentially a Beauty and the Beast retelling set in a Vietnamese-inspired fantasy world that feels a little sci-fi at times in ways that are very interesting. It's a sort of post-colonial dystopia where the Vanishers were the race or species, it's kind of unclear what they were, who came and colonized and exploited everything there was to exploit, and then left this world in shambles. The Vietnamese rep is definitely own voices in this. I am not certain about the queer rep, because this is a female-female romance, and there are also non-binary characters in this story, and I'm not sure if either of those are own voices representation or not. Next is a book from an author who has the distinction of being recommended by me in these Babbles videos 3 years in a row now, and this is Blanca y Roja by Anna Marie McLemore. This is a young adult, fairy tale-ish, magical realism fantasy standalone novel inspired primarily by Snow White and Rose Red and to a certain extent by Swan Lake. Anna Marie McLemore is a queer Latina author, and she centers queer and Latinx representation and storylines in her books. This one is about two Latina sisters and how they are viewed in their community based on colorism. There are also queer characters in this, but I'm not certain if any of the specific types of queer representation in this book are own voices or not. So those were the books that I had to recommend for you that I've read in the past year that I liked enough to recommend and that had own voices, diverse representation in them. What is sorely drastically missing from this list is disability representation and neurodiversity representation. I know I have own voices books with both types of representation on my TBR that have been on my TBR a long time, but apparently I am just not reading them. So that is my note to myself. Also, it is not at all an excuse, but I do feel like disability and neurodiversity rep fall into the category of things where it's hard to tell sometimes if the representation you're reading is own voices or not, because that information isn't always readily available about authors. But because there was this glaring absence on this list, and because these types of representation weren't included in the previous Babbles topics for previous years that were separated into PoC and LGBTQ+, I did go back through my bookshelves to find something that I could recommend to you for at least one of these types of representation. So, a lesser-known backlist title that I'd like to recommend is The Phoenix Dance by Dia Calhoun, which is a young adult 12 Dancing Princesses retelling that is own voices for bipolar disorder. Dia Calhoun was one of my favorite authors when I was a teenager. When I was in high school, I read and reread her books avidly. I think most of them are out of print, and I do think this is out of print now, but you can find used copies online. And I reread this back when my channel was newish and talked a good deal about it then, but it's one of those books that doesn't come up so often in my videos anymore because I much more frequently talk about things I've recently read. This was published in 2005, so it reads kind of younger by today's YA standards, and it also doesn't have as sophisticated world building as we kind of expect from YA published nowadays, but it really does center the 12 Dancing Princesses retelling around Phoenix's bipolar disorder and discusses issues like seeking medication for mental illness. So in a video where I was talking about a lot of new releases, I think it's a good reminder that own voices fiction, even if we didn't call it that until recently, has been around a long time. And the older own voices backlist books do exist. We are just maybe talking about them more openly now. Anyhow, this one was a monster to film, and I am drained. Let me know if you've read any of these books or what you think. Let me know if you have any of your own recommendations. I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.